Thank you very much for that introduction. First of all, I'd really like to send my thanks to PMI for this invitation to speak to you and be involved in this event. I believe it's been a successful event. We've been able to network with a lot of colleagues and really understand the direction of this organization. What I'd like to do is talk to you today about my experiences in dealing with large infrastructure projects. Now, I just want to preface this by saying that there are companies that have already matured and set up their procedures for managing large infrastructure projects. We've seen a lot of that today, especially with the likes of Saudi Aramco and SABIC, and understanding the risks that your facilities already pose upon the nation. And so I'm not going to be talking about the industrial side of infrastructure. I'm going to be talking about some things that we've seen in the recent past of other infrastructure that's being developed throughout the kingdom, largely associated with Vision 2030 to provide new infrastructure, new roads, new buildings, new transportation systems, and getting into some of the details of where we can have gaps in contracting and where we can ultimately create errors with how we deal with contractors and the end products that are eventually delivered. So a couple of things that I want to do is I want to take you on a journey that I've experienced from originating my career in Chicago, Illinois, USA, and how eventually I progressed into some of the wild dreams of the UAE in terms of some of their infrastructure expansion. And then talk about what does it mean when we talk about infrastructure. Well, mostly we talk about buildings. It's important to distinguish between the two and sort of see how they can become blended. And it's not always easy to identify what would be regulated as a building versus what would be regulated as infrastructure. I'll dive briefly into some of the local regulations and how you can look to apply them and some of the hurdles that you might need to overcome. And then I'll focus on the consents and approvals, how do we develop them, and ultimately incorporate them into pre-tender documents. So we're going to start with downtown Chicago. This is one of my favorite cities. Not during the winter. Summer, it's an amazing city. You can walk around this city for hours and hours. And the infrastructure is superb. Now, it is somewhat unique because this is a very relatively old city when it comes to its infrastructure. They've built some of the oldest infrastructure currently operational in the United States. The only oldest infrastructure beyond that is the likes of a lot of the stuff in New York City. Don't tell that to Chicagoans, though. I'm very proud of their city. But they should be. This is a Google 3D globe map of view from the north side looking south of Chicago. You can see the Sears Tower, now renamed the Willis Tower in the upper right-hand corner. And you can see the river that divides the northern part of Chicago and the southern part of Chicago. And just past the river, it's called the famous Loop, which is basically circled by the elevated trainway that creates a loop around the downtown area of the city. So I had the joy every day of making my way through the city where I lived just north of Millennium Park and had to walk through the city, across the river to our West Fulton Street office, which at the time was our headquarters, where we had our corporate office of Rolf Jensen, eventually turning into Jensen Hughes. And during that commute, every single day, I was able to admire and utilize the infrastructure that came with this city. Now, some of the oldest infrastructure is what's called the L. That's short for the elevated trainway. Now, this trainway was constructed in 1892, well before we had any fire code regulations surrounding the NFPA 130 for trainways. That standard didn't come for almost 100 years after this. But this infrastructure is very, very useful. It gets you around the city very quickly. There are stops every few blocks. But again, it's very noisy, it's elevated, there's really no sound dampening. But it's worked, it's survived, very limited gaps in service. Only it seems like when I was wanting to take it to the airport with a half-an-hour delay. Another piece of really beautiful infrastructure that they've really revamped in the last decade or so was this thing called Lower Wacker Drive. So they originally built this in 1926, where they created a two-tiered road system to go under Wacker, and then they've expanded it beyond just Wacker to include this walkway near the river, and then on the right-hand side you can see this two-tiered system. So above this picture is a roadway, and then you can see the intermediate roadway below. This doesn't necessarily look like infrastructure, it's just a roadway, but what you realize when you get underneath is that it's actually a full network of another tier road system. Something that we're starting to see here in Saudi Arabia. We're starting to see master plans that are developing this two-tiered system so that you can put the infrastructure that isn't necessarily sightly to see beneath all your beautiful buildings. Another thing that I was able to enjoy during the winter, I still like to walk around the city, but now I could do it inside. I didn't have to go outside in the freezing cold, and if you've ever heard Chicago is the windy city, well, it's not really known for the climate wind, but for the politicians speaking outwardly, but it does create a lot of wind with the high-rise buildings, so it can get very cold, and they've created this pedway. It's an underground system of pedestrian walkways. Originally built in 1951 and since been expanded multiple times, looks something like this, where we get multiple buildings connected together that created a network so that pedestrians can walk through the city, even during the winter months. The last piece of infrastructure that I really wanted to highlight was Oakley Station. Now, the station was originally built in 1911 and had been expanded and built upon, and as the city expanded, they noticed that there was a lot of very costly property that could potentially be built above the station. So in the 1980s, they built Ogilvy Station and the tower above it, which is a high-rise tower sitting directly above the station. And you can see the tower on the left and the platform on the right. And Rolf Jensen at the time had been involved heavily in designing the fire safety features. And it was very challenging because you have to vent all of the fumes that are being produced by the engines all the way to the atmosphere, which is easy in the yard portion of the station. But when you get underneath the buildings, you now need to vent those fumes all the way to the top of the building. And there's many, many other examples of infrastructure. You've got highways going through buildings. We've got naval piers that have been converted to amusement attractions and assembly occupancies. We've got a number of outdoor stadiums and theaters. All of these are creating a very interesting city to live in and to work and play. So, going from my experience in Chicago, not really truly appreciating the regulations of building infrastructure, to then coming and starting to work in these mega projects in the Middle East, I started noticing there were some gaps that we were not seeing in the original RFPs that should be within those RFPs that eventually form the contract documents. So this is the first project that I really got heavily involved in that was this blend of building versus infrastructure. Now this project never got built. We designed it up through schematic design, but this was originally designed by TVS Design out of Atlanta, Georgia. And we were going back and forth to Dubai and asking a lot of questions on how is this mini city going to operate. Well, I say mini city, this is 1 out of 7. This was supposed to be a series of 7 pearls that were going to be built in the lagoons of Dubai. And some of the features that were teetering into building infrastructure is it had multiple levels of parking underneath. Okay, that was fine, but how do you get to that parking? Well, they created these ring roads that were underground, below grade, and these ring roads resemble road tunnels in most instances. So now you're getting into blending. Is it a building, is it a parking lot, or is it a tunnel? Now they had 4 featured towers ranging from 60 to 100 floors, a lot of office, residential, mixed use, which had a lot of atriums in them. And then surrounding those 4 towers, there was 50 building plots. This was a mini city. And that needed the infrastructure to get people in and out of the city. There were many internal open atrium spaces that were connecting a lot of the building areas. And then there was a public transportation network that was going to connect all the pearls. So now we're blending. What is it? Is it a building or is it infrastructure? Another one, Masdar City. Now this one has been partially built. Since then, the master plan has been redesigned and reshaped over the years. But one thing that they were focusing on is sustainability and how do they achieve some of their sustainability KPIs. Well, they decided to put a lot of the infrastructure in what was called an undercroft to support the electric vehicles that were going to be servicing all buildings, including both public transportation as well as the maintenance and the supplies and deliveries. Everything was going to be underneath this undercroft. So now again, you're taking these buildings and you're putting these road tunnels, and it really wasn't a road tunnel, it was electric vehicles, so very complicated master planning. In addition to that, they didn't want buildings to be spread far apart like we're used to. They didn't want to have all these roadways because they weren't going to be using vehicles. And they wanted to take the benefit of shading these pedestrian ways, so they put the buildings really close together. And that created issues with fire spread. How does fires get protected from one building to the next? Well, leapfrog. And then there was another issue of a lot of renewable energies and recycled materials, a lot of concrete encasing plastics and whatnot. So it really kind of questioned and put the building code on its head. I have to give credit to people that we worked with at Arrow that really developed the master plan, and we helped them refine it as we were using it. So from those projects that were in the heyday before the financial crash in Dubai, we've still seen these master plan projects that are currently ongoing and being built here in Saudi Arabia. Now, a couple that are close to this conference are the sites surrounding the Holy Mosque of Haram. We've worked on many expansions of the Mataf. We've worked on the neighboring developments, Jebel Omar development, and then King Abdulaziz's Road leading into Jebel Omar, Barrage Al Bayt, and that's just to name a few. And again, a lot of these, when we're looking at the contracting of these are contracted as buildings. And there's a missing element that creates a gap in how we develop the strategies for these types of buildings. So let's get into it. What is a building versus infrastructure? Well, buildings is easy. It's defined in the building code. Its structure is usually enclosed to provide support or shelter for intended occupancy. Very easy, simple, right? Well, what's not defined is infrastructure. The building code says that it applies to all structures. It doesn't exclude certain types of structures or buildings. But in my mind, what does infrastructure mean? Infrastructure is just fundamental facilities and systems that are necessary for society or economy to function. And if you do not have that infrastructure, then you have to ask, what happens to society and the economy? So let's go through some examples. All right, High Regency, Jebel Omar. It's not really infrastructure. You don't need that infrastructure for society or economy to function. Maybe you need a hotel infrastructure nationwide, in which case all you need is the facilities to allow them to build those hotels, but individual buildings, not necessarily. Okay, Kingdom Center Riyadh, is that infrastructure? It's a mixed-use development, residential, offices, retail mall. I mean, it's an icon of Riyadh's landscape and skyline. But is it truly infrastructure? Maybe not. Maybe not. Kind of depends on who's the stakeholder looking at it. All right. Well, let's take the hypothetical, previously designed Masdar headquarters. It's a building. It's usually used for offices and conventions and whatnot. This actually was never built. It was redesigned by somebody else. But originally, this was planned to actually provide power to the Masdar energy grid. So in that respect, yeah, it could be considered infrastructure depending on whether or not that building lost functionality. Well, how would it affect that local energy grid? What about the PIF tower? Now, okay, again, high-rise building, but it's supposed to be the hub of the financial district in Riyadh. So in the future, could it be part of infrastructure? I mean, if we end up losing a key tenant that would be potentially housing a major bank infrastructure, stock market infrastructure, yeah, that could be. Other examples, we got Saudi telecom facilities. Don't have any high-profile pictures of their telecom exchanges, but or data centers. But again, yeah, depending on the strategy that they've used and depending on the redundancy they have, it could be considered infrastructure. Same with road tunnels, Riyadh Metro, King Khalid International Airport. Now, these are now coming back as a surgence into the 2030 vision of redeveloping areas, Western Riyadh, Western Province, Neom, and the Red Sea. And what are the infrastructure that each of those individual master plans going to need? They're going to need transportation, so whether it's airport, railways, boatways, what's sufficient in terms of power, redundancy in their power, just availability of water, so on and so forth. Obviously, we mentioned transportation infrastructure, communication facilities, mission-critical facilities, and power infrastructure, so in the future expanding into nuclear power. So how does this get regulated? Well, it's kind of loosely regulated. A lot of the times what we'll see is, okay, we'll follow local regulations. So where do we go? Well, for fire safety, we go to civil defense, unless it's Saudi Aramco or HCIS. We'll have to look at civil defense. Well, civil defense has reinvigorated the Saudi building code. And they've come up and said, okay, well, there's SBC 801 and 201 that give us guidelines on fire safety standards. Well, when I look at infrastructure, this is really the only clause that gives us an out to follow something else other than the Saudi building code. And it really just says that, you know, the fire official can determine compliance with the codes or standards for those activities. That's it. So now, if you're going to insert into a contract saying follow the local regulations for infrastructure, well, now they have to go to the local authority, and then the local authority has to say what they want for the infrastructure. It's a process that isn't well defined, and it depends on each individual facility. So oftentimes we go to NFPA, if we're allowed, and here are examples of specific NFPA guidelines and standards for different types of infrastructure projects. So we got data centers, telecommunication facilities, fixed guideway transit and rail systems, airport terminal buildings, road tunnels, and power plants. There are others that are also available, but these are primarily the ones that we've seen and need to have been used in the recent past and what we expect to be used in the future. Now, the one major difference that each of these types of standards has that isn't part of the building code is that these regulations require more engineering and less prescriptive-based design. So we see in our contracts a lot of times, wherever there's two regulations that conflict, you have to use the most stringent, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't really work when it comes to fire engineering. Because in fire engineering, more is not better. You have to be very concise with what your strategy is. And you have to pick and choose sometimes. And you can see this in different nations. Some nations have older buildings. They want to use more compartmentation. Some buildings really don't care about the buildings. They just want to provide sprinkler protection. Some say, oh, no, we'll just control the smoke. But all of these have somewhat conflicting strategies when, if you're using more compartmentation, you don't want more holes for smoke control. And so we're really getting into fire risk-based approaches, engineering analysis and performance-based design, and design-basis processes. And there's a very set standard for the process that you need to go through. It's not saying exactly what you have to do. So when you're just following a process, it has individuals that need to make very critical decisions throughout the entire process. Here's an example on the right-hand side. I know you can't see it, but it just gives you an idea that there is a process there on how to document one of these engineering analyses. And what these also say is that you need to involve all the stakeholders. So you can't have a contractor go by himself, do something he thinks is right, and then at the very end, come and ask for your approval. We need to set the process early. So what do we look at? We look at, okay, who are the stakeholders and what consents and approvals do they need to give at each step of the way? So the first step is really kind of identifying who they are. I mean, here's just a very generic list, but usually it's going to include the ownership. Hopefully the PMC is going to be involved and their engineers that are overseeing the design, a lead consultant, all the local authorities. Local authorities may or may not require local third parties. But one thing that's always missing, but is always included in the performance-based design for fire protection, is a qualified specialist. Not only to do the design and make the decisions throughout the process, but to also peer review and make sure that those decisions are in accordance with industry practice. So we take that one level further. Now we've identified our stakeholders. How do we start wrapping this into how that can be transferred into a contract? So we first look at what is the minimum level of documentation that would be needed, and then where do the stakeholders need to get involved? What documentation do they need to review and when? And once we get that whole matrix pulled together, we can start assigning gateways on when each one needs to happen and what needs to happen before you go to the next gateway. So when we're looking at the minimum level of documentation, the Saudi Building Code does not tell you that. It tells you that for civil and for architectural, but not related to fire safety. So you have to go into those individual standards and extract out those minimum requirements for documentation. All that can be easily done within a few days worth of work for any project, and they're all documented, but they're all spread out through all the NFPA standards. We've got templates that can be used, checklists, all that's readily available and can be provided, but it's typically not, should be. Here's something that would look like a matrix. So you identify each design phase across the top and each stakeholder down the side, and you start identifying who needs what and when. So here'd be an example of a recent infrastructure project in the UAE where they were using a design-build contract mechanism to tender this. We've identified that not only do you need a contractor's lead fire and life safety specialist to do the design, but you also need that independent fire and life safety specialist, and we expect them to review everything along the way so that the process is done correctly. We've oftentimes seen that this won't be done in concept, it won't be done in schematic, it won't be done in DD. It'll be done when they're ready to get a local authority approval, and the local authority asks for a third party. Unfortunately, by that time, all the decisions have already been made. It's already too late. And not only do we then expand upon this matrix, but we provide what is the expectation on the racing. Who's responsible, accountable, who needs to be informed, who needs to be consented, and it gives a roadmap for what this would look like. Now, this doesn't always have to be exact on the project because the projects evolve and adapt. More stakeholders get added, some get removed, but at least it gives upfront the expectation on who needs to be involved from day one. Because if it's not there, as Mohammed said earlier, is that it's not in the contract, it's going to cause problems later on. Either you're going to be asked for variation orders or your project's just going to suffer. And so we've seen it many times that these large infrastructure projects are missing this guidance up front in the pre-tender stage. So in conclusion, we need to understand that oftentimes infrastructures have an interaction with buildings. Buildings have an interaction with infrastructure, but they're not always the same thing. The risks need to be studied and constantly managed. And when you get to infrastructure projects, the consequences of your risk matrix are always increased. And that the specific regulations are not always referenced by the building code. So you cannot have a blanket statement that use the local codes, local standards. Because unless it's a mature client that already has their risks identified, like I said, like an Aramco or a Sabic, they're not going to be in there from day one. And that the review processes should be planned. prior to tender, so that it is already included up front, and that there's no excuses for the contractors not to be aware that this is something that they should do in their planning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.